Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you all had a good break. My name is Chrisbin James. Chris James. I'm a PhD student at the School of Agriculture and Food Sustainability at the University of Queensland. We're from Brisbane, Australia. And my PhD is focused on applying machine learning and computer vision to develop methods for phenotyping panicle-related traits in sorghum, and more specifically, how we can use 3D modeling and deep learning to access finer or more complex geometric phenotypes. So this talk will be focusing on applying Neural Radiance Fields, or NeRFs, via UAVs for 3D scalable reconstruction of sorghum canopies in the field. So just to provide you a little bit of more context for my PhD, I'm working primarily with grain sorghum, and I'm focusing on deriving panicle-related traits. So we're looking at things like panicle count, panicle morphology, and grain count per panicle. Panicle morphology and grain count per panicle are very time-consuming and expensive phenotypes to screen, and especially in field trials. Traditionally, these traits have always been measured using destructive methodologies and at very small scales. So if you wanted to do anything in the field, you'd have to go harvest a small subset of panicles, bring it back, image it, and thresh it. So in a nutshell, my PhD aims to develop non-invasive and high throughput, that's a relative term, but still high throughput phenotyping methods to make these traits a little bit more accessible. So my first chapter focused on developing a methodology where we use a plain RGB camera to create a surface-level 3D model of a sorghum panicle. And we try to estimate the total grain count for the panicle based on the shape and size of the panicle. And we also look at the image of the panicle to get an idea of how the grains are distributed along the surface. So our model takes the input as a point cloud and an image as well, and it'll try and predict the total number of grains for the panicle. Our data set was relatively small. We had 170 3D modeled sorghum panicles, but we sampled our data set with a nice variety in grain count and panicle size. So we had very small panicles which were closed with only about 400 to 500 grains, to large and dense and open panicles with about almost 5,000 grains. So our models were able to estimate grain count with an average error rate of 6.8% or 186 grains. Now, granted, these models were very high resolution and they were all imaged in a lab, but it did show promise that you can estimate grain count on a per panicle basis if you have a decent shape to describe the panicle. So for my second chapter, the idea was, okay, we have this method, now how do we scale it out? And the objective was to develop a method to phenotype 3D panicle morphology in the field on a plot scale, and which is what this talk is about. And in order to do this, I had to achieve three objectives. The first was I needed to develop a scalable imaging solution to reconstruct canopy architecture in the field. And second, I needed to develop a framework for generating 3D sorghum canopies, and this is the important bit, with accurate and consistent panicle geometry to generate label data to train deep learning models. And finally, I needed to evaluate all the models I trained on my synthetic data and test them on real annotated data sets to see how well they can generalize to real canopy models. And this would essentially allow you to derive some panicle-related traits from the 3D models you obtain in the field. Right, low-altitude UAV flights, these are usually about 5 meters or less, are one common way of creating 3D canopy models in the field. You could also use LiDARs, but for my project, I'm focusing on drones. So most methods in the literature propose flying in a circular pattern. Sometimes it's also known as a cross-circle oblique pattern, so where you fly the drone on top of the image you want to image, on top of the plot you want to image, and it sort of encircles the plot, and it's looking at the center of the plot while the drone's flying, and the camera gimbal angle is set to 45 degrees. For instance, this is a study which uses a similar kind of flight pattern to 3D model maize and soybean canopies in the field. Now, there are two important things to consider while you do this. The first thing is that if you use a structure from motion-based method to create 3D canopy models, your models can only reliably model the upper part of the canopy. So if you look at this example here, when the plants are quite small, the drone can capture most of the geometry and the architecture of the plant. But as they continue to grow, there's a lot of occlusion in the canopy, and your drones can only sort of see the upper part of the canopy. So this is a method which is reliable to only look on the top part of the canopy. And the second and the more important bit is that most papers for now do this using still images, which severely limits the throughput capacity of this method. For instance, in this paper, they were looking to 3D model a 5 by 5 meter plot, and then they were using still images to do it. So with the data acquisition protocol they had, it took about 5 minutes to do this. And for a drone battery, even at full capacity, at best you can get is 30 minutes. So this is not very scalable. So we propose a very simple solution to address the second problem. The first one, well, we can't really do much about it. So when you're flying at 5 meters, your ground sampling distance is high enough that if you fly the drone and record video while using the maximum shutter speed, the blur you get for your images is minimal, or at least acceptable enough to do 3D photogrammetry. So if you just do this little modification, for our experiments, we use the DJI Mavic 3E, which is a pretty standard RGB drone. So we flew at 5 meters, just like the experiment cited here, but we flew at 2.5 meters per second, and we were recording video while we were doing this. And this essentially allowed us to image a 6 by 6 meter plot in just under 20 seconds. So now this method becomes a tad bit more scalable, and you can start looking at more plots. Right, so earlier this year in January, we had a small sorghum trial at the University of Queensland's Gatton campus. We had 14 varieties of commercial grain sorghum, and over the growing season, we had a total set of 8 measurements, which included biomass cuts and a weekly schedule of panicle measurements. So this was starting from panicle emergence to all the way to maturity. We were just modeling the canopy architecture to see how it developed over time. So for each panicle, we measured the fresh weight, the dry weight, and the grain count. So before we did a UAV flight, within each plot, we'd randomly sample a panicle, and we'd mark it with some pink tape. And immediately after finishing the UAV flight, we'd harvest the panicle and we'd take it back to our lab, and where we would make a reference high-resolution 3D model of the panicle. And the objective here was to compare the shape and geometry of the panicle, which we get in the lab, and to see how accurately it correlates with the 3D reconstruction in the field, which you get with the UAVs. So this is how the raw data from the drone looks. And we've also got the 3D point cloud model if you sort of process your images with the standard photogrammetry software. If you focus on the result of the 3D point cloud model, if you zoom in a little bit, you can see that the 3D models are a little bit coarse and rough, especially if your objective is to localize and separate individual instances of each panicle. So this is where NeRFs come in. So there's been a little bit of a shift in paradigm for 3D modeling since the introduction of NeRFs, or Neural Radiance Fields. As most of you know, NeRFs are a special class of deep learning algorithms which learn a high-level 3D density representation of any given scene, given that you have a set of images and the camera poses and the estimates where each image was taken. And after you train a NeRF model, it can generate new images from novel views or unseen camera positions. And this would essentially allow you to interpolate and also create high-quality 3D point cloud models. And even in the plant phenotyping community, in the past 2 years, there's a lot of work which has come out which has focused on using the capability of NeRFs for high-quality 3D reconstruction to develop phenotyping methods. So after pre-processing your raw drone imagery, as you normally would in a traditional photogrammetry pipeline, so we use RGSoft for most of our software pipelines, as some of you here are already familiar with. There's a step where you have to align and optimize your photos. And when you fly your drone, you know the latitude and the longitude where each camera is taken, and it also records the gimbal parameters. But in these traditional SfM softwares, you also run SIFT-based feature matching algorithms across images to optimize your camera positions. And to train a NeRF model, these are the only two things you require. You would require your raw images and a set of parameters to define where each image was taken. So these are two point cloud models which we have generated for the same set of images from a NeRF and from a traditional RGSoft pipeline. The NeRF-generated model is much more dense and consistent compared to the point cloud generated by RGSoft. On the right, you can see a zoomed-in view of the region around the reference panicle, which is tagged to be imaged in the lab. Again, the NeRF point cloud model is more defined, it's less noisy, and you can also potentially use this to estimate leaf angle, but we didn't really end up taking any leaf angle measurements in the field, so that's not something we've started to look at yet, but there's also definitely potential for that. So yeah, NeRFs essentially allow us to create enhanced 3D digital twin models just using RGB data. And in my case, the resolution is high enough to be reliably able to identify individual panicles and their morphology, and even in very dense canopies. And some works in the past have explored to do this using terrestrial LiDARs. And one of the key challenges they repeatedly faced was when the panicles were very closely clumped together. It was very difficult to distinguish small panicles just with terrestrial LiDAR data. Right, so now we've got a very sharp point cloud model which looks very pretty. But in order to process all of this data and get some value and traits out of it, you'd have to train computer vision models, which usually require huge amounts of labeled and annotated 3D point cloud data. Labeling images is hard enough, but labeling point clouds is a lot more work and very time consuming. And as a PhD student, I don't have an army of annotators working under me. So my approach was, and the other thing is that we also sort of need to account for panicle morphology at different growth stages, especially with small and emerging panicles within very dense canopy models. The solution we came up with was, so for my first chapter, we had collected a lot of high-resolution 3D panicle models. So we developed a static canopy generation model. And I'd just like to make the clarification now, it's not a functional structural plant model, it's just a static plant generation model. So to generate a single sorghum plant, we first create the stem using our 3D panicle mesh model as the base, as we often capture the peduncle part of the panicle in the mesh. And as you gradually move down the panicle's base, you gradually increase the stem diameter. And instead of procedurally generating the leaf geometry for now, we are using the mesh models of real 3D scanned sorghum plants extracted from a publicly available 3D sorghum dataset published by a group from Purdue University. So you can essentially treat these stem models as internodes, and then the leaves are grafted onto the junctions of these circles forming the stems. So yeah, they're basically internodes, at least as far as these models are concerned. And to generate 3D models of the entire canopy, for now we define a few basic parameters like in the plot configuration, and this will in turn dictate the density of the canopy, which includes the arrangements of the leaves on the stems, specifically their positioning and the leaf angle and the clumping of panicles. So for now, it's a purely geometric model. So you have a few definable parameters like the number of rows in the plot, the inter-row spacing, the spacing between the plants or the planting density. And we're also introducing some randomness by adding some noise to these plot parameters. And you can also specify the average canopy height and the number of leaves for each plot. So the objective here is to generate a wide variety of plot configurations to train robust deep learning models. Now, ensuring consistent and non-overlapping geometry is very important for high-quality training data. So we procedurally generate the entire canopy arrangement. So to generate a dense canopy model as such one in this example, we load each element individually. First, each panicle is assigned a 3D position on a grid, which describes its location and height. And then you procedurally generate the stem. And after loading the panicle and the stem models, we create a bounding volume tree for all the existing objects within the scene. And then we track the space occupancy to prevent any overlaps. And then finally, when you load the trees, it's essentially a search and optimization problem where you have a set of available internode junctions and you try and fit different leaf angles and different leaf inclinations in a way that they don't overlap. So this would allow you to generate consistent and dense canopy structures with sub-centimeter level organ spacing. So here you can visualize the instance labels for individual components of a generated canopy model highlighted in different colors. And now this data can be in turn used to train deep learning models. So we generate synthetically labeled dataset to train models for two tasks. The first is a semantic segmentation model to classify the canopy model into panicle, leaf, and stem. And the second is a detection model to identify all the individual instances of the panicles. So for our baseline models, we train a modified version of PointNet++ and VoteNet. So we've come up with a custom voting module, which I'm happy to discuss later if anybody's interested. And I'd also like to mention, and these are two seminal deep learning architectures in point cloud literature to do these tasks. But yeah, and the other thing I'd like to mention is that we train these models as purely point cloud models. So we're not including any color or normal information. So these models would pass the canopy models purely based off of geometry and no additional information. And this is the not so fun part. So we actually had to sample our data set across different growth stages and manually annotate them for panicle detection and panicle segmentation. And the idea behind this was we would train our model on synthetic data, validate our model on synthetic data, and then see how well they can generalize to real data without being trained on any instances which are labeled on real data sets. So these are the initial results from our models. So at the top, you can see a raw point cloud model of the canopy. The middle of the slide shows you the segmentation and the detection results for the same point cloud model. And at the bottom, you can see the extracted masks for each individual panicles. So we found that the models which we trained on our synthetically generated data sets can generalize relatively well to real point clouds. So it can detect all the panicles at 0.5 IOU with a mean IOU of 0.83, and the segmentation accuracy for the panicle pixels is 93%. And there's a reason why I chose this specific example is because if you look at the top point cloud model, it's in 3D, but there's a tiny little emerging panicle over there, which is sort of hidden behind the leaf. It's not very apparent from this image, but we had enough instances in our synthetic data sets to train for specific cases like that. So if you look at the segmentation results, we do pick up that tiny little panicle which is just budding out, and then we're also able to detect and account for that panicle. Yep, and like I mentioned before, we were also making high-resolution 3D models for all of our reference panicles, which were tagged in the field. So after they're harvested, we bring them back to the lab, and we've got an imaging tent where we take lots of high-resolution RGB imagery with a DSLR camera, and this essentially gives us a very high-resolution point cloud model, on average at least 2 to 4 million points to describe a single point cloud. And then we treat this high-resolution point cloud as a ground truth model, and then we compare how well the geometry aligns with what we see in the field with the UAV reconstruction. On average, we found that across different growth stages, the panicle height measurements correlated fairly well with the actual measurements of the panicles. with an average error of 0.54 across all 140 panicles which we had harvested and collected, of course, on multiple growth stages. So that finishes my talk. I'd like to acknowledge the University of Queensland and GRDC Australia for funding my project, and of course my supervisors and my wonderful, wonderful team. As my background is mostly computer science and data analytics, I required a lot of help setting up in the field, collecting my data, and doing a lot of logistics related work. So none of this wouldn't have been possible without their help. And that's it from me. Thanks for all of your attention.
Thank you, Chris, for presenting what seems a formidable amount of work. We have approximately 3 minutes for some questions.
Thank you very much for the very nice talk and interesting results to be able to see. I was curious about the NeRF calculation times, because today they are compute intense.
Yep.
And those times are coming down. But do you know, can you make a prediction how fast this calculation time will go down into the future?
Well, I can't say for sure, but at the end it depends on the resolution you want for the task you're trying to do. In my case, I wanted the highest quality point clouds possible, so I trained the biggest and the biggest version of the NeRF cloud, and I trained it for a lot of iterations so that I was able to get to a level where I was able to localize each individual panicle. But if you need a rough 3D point cloud model of your scene, you could use smaller variants of NeRF models, which gives you results more quickly. I guess I'd say it depends on the use case, what resolution you really want to be working with.
Thanks. So my question, maybe this is a little bit naive as far as the NeRF method goes, but it makes very pretty pictures, and you said you use kind of like the mesh or the point clouds for your actual calculations. How much distortion of actual geometry comes into those?
Right. So it'll depend on how you collect your data. So even with standard photogrammetry, if you have ideal image capture conditions where your lighting is mostly consistent, nothing ever moves, the quality of your models would be better. But in the field, obviously, that's not the case. Most of my flights were done during 6:30 to 7 a.m. in the morning, where we try to sort of account for the weather and minimize wind. So the more movement and the more uneven lighting conditions you have would definitely affect the quality of your 3D model, be it traditional photogrammetry or NeRFs. But I did find that NeRFs are a little bit more robust compared to traditional photogrammetry if there's movement while you're trying to image your scenes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.